Cables. If you want to connect a thing to another thing in your home studio, you kind of need them. So, in this week's Studio Live Today podcast, we're talking all things cables, the different types, how you connect them, and removing the mystery that surrounds how to connect your gear to your other gear in the home studio. My name is Pete Johns. This is the Studio Live Today podcast. My goal around here is to help you create, record, and release your best music. We do that through tips and tricks and tutorials and this weekly podcast. So let's dive in and talk cables, because I get more questions than probably anything else in the home studio about how to connect things to other things. And if you don't know the right sort of cable to use, sometimes you can go a little astray. Now, I've got a resource for you, because of course I do, over at studiolivetoday.com/cables. Funnily enough, I've got my cable guide, not Cable Guy, not the Jim Carrey movie, my cable guide, where I've got a list of all of the different cables, and I've separated this out by category. So the thing that you're connecting to or from, because I figured that's an easier way to look at it. Let's look at it from the point of view of, you want to connect up your guitar, you want to hook up your speakers, you want to plug in your mixer or your interface, because that's what people are facing. You don't need to go out there and buy all the XLR and TRS and TS and all the other cables if you're never going to use them. So start with that. What are you connecting to what? And therefore, what do you need to get? We're going to go through category by category, and you can follow along as we go through over on the website, or just listen in and then go and check out that resource. There are links on there as well. Those are affiliate links. So if you're looking to buy some cables, you can jump in there and buy them on Amazon or Sweetwater or eBay. They're all there. And if you're looking for other gear for your home studio, studiolivetoday.com/gear is the place to go. Let's start with headphones. Yeah, we all use headphones, whether you're using them to mix or master or to track your vocals or your guitars in the home studio. You generally need a pair of headphones of some sort. So what do they have to do with cables? Well, most of your headphones will actually come with a cable, and these days the majority of them come with a 3.5mm and a 6.35mm adapter. That's the old 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch. And if you know these, you'll know that you plug one into the other. If you're using it in something like an iPhone, not that iPhones have it, but an older iPad that might have a headphone jack, or maybe your Mac or your PC has a headphone jack, then you can use that little 3.5mm. Or if you're going into more sort of pro audio gear, you'll need an adapter. So the main adapters that we have are the 3.5mm to 6.35mm adapters. If you're watching the video version, you're looking at one now, but you've probably seen these. They're very simple. You plug your little plug in one end and you get your big plug out the other end. Now, these use what are called TRS connections, which stands for tip, ring, and sleeve. So again, if you're looking at the image, or if you're checking this out on the gear guide afterwards, you'll see that there's a tip, and then there's a ring and a sleeve. There are 3 sections separated by 2 black lines, or if you've got a gold plug, other colored lines there. So that tells you that it's got 3 different things. One is for your left, one's for your right, and one's the ground. So you need that. If you had just a TS cable or a TS adapter, that's mono. Tip, sleeve, just one thing, because your tip and your sleeve, one's your ground and one's your mono signal. So you need to make sure that you have a TRS adapter to plug your headphones in if you are using a different size headphone jack. The other things I have on there are things like double adapters. These can be super handy for the home studio. Let's say that you've only got one headphone output, but you got 2 people that want to listen into your mix on headphones, or you're recording 2 people at once on 2 different microphones for a podcast or something else. Yeah, you can grab yourself a double adapter. Once again, just make sure that you're using an adapter that is TRS, tip, ring, sleeve. And don't worry, we'll talk more about TRS, TS, and TRRS a little later. I know, so many acronyms. We'll break it down though, don't stress, it's all good. Let's talk about speakers. So if you're not using headphones, you might be connecting to some monitor speakers, and the vast majority of monitor speakers will use what's called a TRS connection. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky, because TRS connections can also be used for balanced connections from a piece of gear, like a mixer or an audio interface, to a speaker. And in that case, you will need 2 TRS cables. Have you ever noticed why you get those dual, they're usually called dual mono TRS cables? Yeah, they're basically exactly the same. This is where people get confused. Your TRS standard can either be used for one unbalanced stereo cable, or it can be used for balanced audio. So the reason that you want balanced audio for your monitor speakers that support it is that balanced actually sends one inverted copy of your signal, and that can actually help remove the noise. This isn't the place to go into all the reasons why, but if you want to dive into it, just go to your YouTube. I think I've done one on the channel here. Do balanced versus unbalanced, and you'll find out why balanced is usually the way to go. So the vast majority of even your consumer and especially your sort of prosumer level speakers are going to have TRS inputs, meaning you need a TRS cable. And again, if you go to studiolive.today.com/cables, you'll be looking at a TRS cable. Again, very similar. They use exactly the same setup as your 1/4-inch headphone cable that's TRS. But again, you can use one TRS for an unbalanced stereo or two TRS for balanced mono, two separate cables to plug in. You can also use XLR. So some monitor speakers have XLR cables, or maybe your mixer has an XLR output. The XLR cable is commonly used for microphones, but it's also used as a sort of a pro audio because XLR cables are always balanced. Have you ever noticed how XLR cables have three little holes in them? For the video folks, I'm holding one up now, but if you've ever used one, or just go to your search engine of choice and type XLR cable, you'll notice that they've got three little holes in the end of them, and that's because that does the same thing as the tip, ring, and sleeve. It's sending two copies of the signal and the ground, and it's doing that via a TRS cable, which means that for most applications, if you've got XLR at one end and TRS at the other, that's going to work too. And there are also cables that do that have TRS at one end and XLR at the other end. You might be thinking at this point, well, what is an instrument cable? Don't worry, we'll get to that. But you can also have what's called a TS cable, tip sleeve, that looks almost exactly the same, that sends just the one signal on the ground. So that's your mono cable that is unbalanced. So if your gear supports TRS or balanced cables, and almost all gear in the home studio these days does, use TRS. If you use TS, you're just going to get a little bit more noise in your signal that can be avoided. The final one here is if you've got some very budget speakers, they may have an RCA jack. Now, these are your classic red and white. Your old VCRs and DVD players had the old red, white, and yellow, or sometimes they're red and black. These are basically the same as a TS. They're carrying one unbalanced signal, and they are subject to a bit of noise. So again, if you have the option, a lot of speakers will have RCA jacks, the red and the white, or the black and the red, and they'll also have TRS jacks. If you can use and by the way, when we say jacks, plug hole, basically. If I ever talk about jack, it just means the socket. You could interchange those words. So your plug goes into your socket, or your jack. We just use jack as in headphone jack in the audio world. So if you do have perhaps some older gear, so you've got an old synth or you've got an old mixer that only has RCA, you can still use it. You just won't get the benefit of having that balanced signal that will be a better quality. Let us talk microphones, shall we? Now, microphones are pretty simple. Almost all microphones will have an XLR connection. Now, if you've got a very budget microphone that doesn't have an XLR connection, you probably want to invest in one that does, to be very honest with you, because in my experience, in my history, I've found that if you are using those cheaper ones that have, say, the built-in cable that only has the 1/4-inch or the TS connection on them, I tend to find that they don't work as well and you don't get the same level of quality. Why? It comes back to the old balanced versus unbalanced. Plus, a microphone that doesn't have XLR, kind of an indicator that it's maybe not the best quality microphone. So the vast majority of your microphones are going to have an XLR connector, and you will need yourself an XLR cable. So you can grab an XLR to XLR cable, which has a male end at one end and a female end at the other. What you're going to find is that most of the time you plug the female, the one into your microphone, and then you plug the male end into your gear. You can get them in different variations, so just check what the connector is on the piece of gear. For instance, a lot of speakers and mixers will actually have it flipped around. So just check what the two plugs are at each end and make sure you get the right sort of cable for your needs. Now, let's pause here for just a jiffy and talk about the quality of cables. Because before we dive into some other things around other bits of gear, your quality of cable is important because these are analog cables. All the ones we've been talking about so far are analog cables, means they're actually sending the signal, and your analog signal needs to go into your digital piece of gear to do the analog to digital conversion. The better the signal, the less noise, the less interference, the higher quality signal goes in there, then the better chance your digital gear is going to have to capture as close to the original sound. Now, that doesn't mean you got to spend hundreds of dollars on cables, but it does mean that perhaps if you're shopping on Amazon or eBay, maybe don't go for the $3 cable, maybe get the $10 or the $20 cable. In my experience, going with cables that are in that middle range from like a brand name is usually a better idea. Amazon Basics and things I've used, and I do continue to use in the home studio. They work fine. There's a brand called Hosa, which makes some budget and affordable cables, which work fine. But yeah, if you go up a couple of notches, you'll generally get yourself better quality. So that's all I'm going to say about quality. You could go into, like, there's forums of people arguing about quality of cables and what you need and what you don't need, etc. But bottom line is you get what you pay for in most cases, but a bit like wine, the difference between a $5 and a $20 bottle of wine is very apparent. The difference between a $20 and a $100 bottle, less apparent. So unless you are an absolute audio junkie, audiophile connoisseur like wine, you probably don't need the $100 cables. Let us continue to talk about keyboards and synths and electronic drums. Now, a lot of that sort of gear is going to be using your TRS. Some of it, again, as we mentioned before, might use RCA or might use straight TS, an unbalanced quarter inch. So that's like your guitar connection, which we'll talk about in just a jiffy. But more often than not, if you've got a keyboard or a synthesizer that has stereo out, it's probably got two TRS outputs, or it could have just plain TS. Now you can, good point to pause here, you can plug a TS cable into a TRS socket and it will work, but it will send an unbalanced signal. So if you're going TRS to TRS, say you've got a synthesizer, you're plugging it into your monitor speakers and you're using TS, if it has a TRS jack, and so does your speaker, I would always use TRS. That balanced signal is always going to get you better quality and better clarity going through, less interference, less chance of noise. So keep that in mind, but most of your gear is going to need a TRS cable, which is your tip, ring, sleeve, your standard quarter-inch cable that we talked about before. What about guitars? I hear you asking, well, if I got a guitar, Johns, you've been telling me through this podcast that these balance cables are amazing. I better get a balance cable for my guitar. Screech, record scratch. No, don't. The vast majority of guitars do not have a TRS jack. They have an unbalanced, very standard, very plain, what we call instrument. Sometimes you'll call it high Z or high Z when you're looking at things like your audio interface or an instrument input, and that is always unbalanced. When I say always, nothing's ever always. That is 99% of the time unbalanced. There are some higher end guitars that have XLR jacks and even TRS jacks for a balanced signal, but don't rely on it. For instance, my Taylor acoustic actually does have a balanced jack for its pickup, but don't trust that your guitar will. And look, it's unlikely you're going to do damage. More likely it's just not going to send any signal because it won't be compatible with that TRS cable. But yeah, you want to generally use a standard instrument cable, guitar cable, TS cable with your guitars because that is what they need. So yeah, just your standard instrument cable will go straight into your mixer or to your audio interface and you'll be good to go. For those watching the video versions, I've got a Hosa cable, $10, straight guitar cable. These days I tend to use Ernie Ball cables, the braided cables for my guitar. I find those really good quality. The ones with the L shape at one end, it just means you can plug that in your guitar and stand your guitar up. If you, like me, you've got a guitar with a plug at the bottom, yeah, sometimes those right angle plugs can actually work a lot better for you. So go and check out the gear guide. Go and buy yourself some good quality guitar cables. It's time to get into the digital realm and start talking about your phone or your tablet. So if you, I've got to update this guide because I'm talking here mostly about headphone jacks. The vast majority of your phones and tablets don't have headphone jacks anymore, so a lot of this doesn't really apply anymore. But there are times where you'll have a piece of gear that has just a headphone jack, and you want to go out from that into another device. And there's a few options there. You can go from 3.5mm to RCA. They're those very common cables that we all had back in the day to plug our iPods into our stereos and our hi-fis. So that's going to have a headphone jack style, a 3.5mm plug at one end and two RCA plugs at the other end. You can also go from that 3.5mm to either a TRS at the other end, so a larger, the 6.35mm, or even a dual TS. So you can go from 3.5mm stereo to a double TS mono. So why would you ever do that? Well, let's just say that you've got a mixer, because again, I probably should have made this really clear, but anything that uses a headphone jack is always unbalanced. There are no balanced headphone jacks. Why? Because all headphone jacks are stereo, and stereo signals use the TRS. They use the tip ring and the sleeve for the left, right, and the ground. Are we with me? I know, it's a lot to know. If you want to skip over that and not worry about it, that's fine. But just trust me on this one, that when you're going from a 3.5mm headphone jack and you want to go into, say, a mixer or an audio interface in stereo, you'll want to have a 3.5mm to as two mono TS cables so that you can plug one into one channel, one into the other channel, and record your stereo input. Unless, of course, your audio interface has stereo input, in which case you can just use a single stereo cable. You can also get things like adapter cables and extension cables for your headphones or for your 3.5mm connections, or you can go from 3.5mm to 3.5mm, which is rarer, but sometimes say you might have monitor speakers that have a headphone input, and then you want to send the output from your phone, your tablet, your MacBook, your whatever that has an old school analog headphone jack. Let's dive down into the world of mixers and audio interfaces. Now, yes, we're getting into some repetition territory here, so I'm not going to go into as much detail with these. Basically, most of your audio interfaces and mixers are going to have 1/4-inch TRS or XLR inputs, or they'll have an instrument input. So your classic two-channel interface will have two channels of combo jacks with an XLR and the ability to plug in a TRS right into the middle of it, or they'll have the ability to plug it in as a TS cable, an instrument cable, and then you need to make sure you flick that little switch or press the button or do whatever you need to do to put it into instrument mode. The reason being is that most of your audio interfaces have two modes. They have a mode for plugging in, like your line input or your microphone input, but you need to actually have the high Z, the high impedance mode for, say, a guitar, because it needs to boost the gain. You'll know that you've done it wrong if you plug your guitar or you plug something in an unbalanced cable and you're not getting enough sound through. Have you ever had that before? Yeah, you've probably got it set to line input or to XLR mode, the microphone mode. Flick it to its other mode. It'll be called instrument or high Z or high Z, and you'll be good to go. So most of the time you're looking for things, you're looking for XLR cables and TRS cables. And in the rare case of some mixers, you may have RCA cables as well. So the cable guide has all of those cables ready for you to check on out. Let's talk connectors and adapters. So if you're converting an RCA to a TS plug or a TS to an RCA plug, a 3.5mm to a 6.35mm TRS plug, there are adapters for that. So keep in mind, whenever you're looking at an adapter, keep in mind that you need to work out whether you're using an unbalanced or a balanced signal. Now, it's really easy because all RCA is unbalanced, all TS, so tip sleeve, those two ones that only have the two sections separated, they're unbalanced. You need at least three thingies to be a balanced cable. So again, you don't need to know what they do or why, but if you look at a cable or if you look at the end of a cable and you can only see two sections to it, so a tip and a sleeve, you know you're dealing with an unbalanced cable. And again, because all XLR cables have those three holes in them and three poles at the other end, you know you're always dealing with a balanced signal. So the reason I mention that is RCA, you might think, well, I'll get my RCA cable into a TRS cable. The reason they don't exist is that they can't. There's no point. It's an unbalanced signal. It doesn't make sense because the cable has to have the 3 at each end to be balanced. And you might say, but what about those TRS cables used for stereo? Well, yeah, they're the exception that proves the rule, that you can have the tip ring sleeve, but again, instead of sending the 2 copies of the signal, one flipped around to avoid noise, they send the left and the right and the balanced, and that's your TRS stereo connection. A couple of little cables here, and then we'll summarize all of this and wrap it up in a nice little bow. So your USB and data and power. So you've got USB-A cables and USB-C cables. You also have lightning cables. In other videos, I go into a lot more detail about this, and there's another website, studiolive today.com/USB, if you want to learn about connecting up your USB gear using that data cable. Here's the simple rules, though. If you're using a lightning-based iPad or iPhone, you need a Lightning to USB 3 adapter. That's the genuine Apple Lightning to USB 3 adapter. It's so important, it's like listed on my gear guide 3 or 4 times. So go over to studiolivetoday.com/gear if you want to see exactly the cable I'm talking about. And if you're using, say, a MacBook, or you're using an iPad or an iPhone that has USB-C, or even a PC that has USB-C, then you'll need a USB-C adapter. Now, you can just go straight from a cable. So if you've got a piece of USB gear and you've got a USB-C iPhone or iPad, you can plug that USB-C cable directly from your gear to your iPad. The reason you may want a USB-C adapter for that is that you might want to power up your devices, or you might want to plug in a powered USB hub. You might want to do a few things like that. So over at the cable guide, we have some suggestions there for what you may want to use to go from, say, USB-C to USB-A, or USB-C to USB-C. And again, if you want to find more information, go to the USB guide at studiolive today.com/USB. The final little tip that I'll give you here is cable management. So I use and rely on and always use one product, and it is the Velcro One Wrap bundling, and it's about $10 to buy a whole roll of this stuff. And the reason I use this is that you can cut it to size. So it's a little Velcro strip. It's quite thick, but you can cut it down the middle to make it thin. And all of my cables, have you ever had that thing where you open the cable drawer and you're like, oh, everything's tangled? Yeah, it doesn't have to be that way. Don't buy those cheap little plastic crappy ones. They don't work well as cable ties. Don't spend a fortune on color coded and everything. These are my golden pieces of thread that I have in my gear, because you can just wrap up your cables and you can use them on any size cable. You can cut them to size, and it's just super versatile. So if you didn't listen to any of that cable stuff, well, you know your cable's in and out, but they're in a bit of a mess and you need to do some cable management and organization, check out the Velcro One Wrap roll. It is very cool, very easy to use, and super duper handy. So that's your cables. Now, we could go into a whole lot more detail because there's obviously a whole bunch of USB-C, Thunderbolt cables, USB-A, USB-B. There's a lot of other cables. Most of the time, the reason I don't cover that in detail, most of the time the gear you get comes with that cable. Or if you need to convert one thing to another, everything uses the USB standard. When it comes to digital stuff, it's all USB. Now, you need to work out which version of USB it is, and we have videos covering that here on the channel, or you can again go to studiolivetoday.com/USB. But if you wanted to know, if you came to this thinking, what's a balanced cable? What's the difference between TS, TRS, and TRRS, and XLR, and all these different standards? Then hopefully this has given you a little bit of insight. But I know I haven't covered everything for everyone. So if you're watching the video version of this, if you're watching live, hopefully you've been commenting as you've gone through. If you're watching on the replay, leave your comments down below. I'm always down there answering questions and more than happy to help. Or if you've got your own tips or the cables that you use, then feel free to recommend those as well down there in the comment section. Don't forget, you can get all the information, my cable guide at studiolivetoday.com/cables, and you can go to studiolivetoday.com to find all the ways that you can interact with me and the Studio Live Today community. Thank you for being here. As we say at the end of each and every show, please be kind to yourself, be kind to others, keep creating, and I'll see you next time on the Studio Live Today podcast.